Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. In this session, we will learn about list and for loop. So let's start our today's session. So now we have our application that basically allows input multiple times and can be terminated with exit input. Now, what if I wanted to calculate the number of hours for several days, but I didn't want to basically just pass it on one after another because that's just too much efforts for me. So let's say I wanted to give it 15 different values, but I don't want to type it in 15 times. I want that application so do the whole calculation for all those 15 values, but I just want to enter that at least once instead of entering each value separately. So in this part, we are going to learn another data type in Python called list. So till now, we have learned several data types like string, for example, as well as integer and float numbers and boolean true or false. And list is just another data type, and the syntax for list is using square brackets, and inside the square brackets we have a list of elements, and those elements can again be either strings, numbers or boolean values. In our case, we want to provide our application with a list of the numbers of days. So we are going to have a list of integers like this, and you can have as many values inside the list as you want, and these are going to be comma separated, and the syntax will look like this. But again, as I said, you can have a list of strings, list of booleans, etc. So as I mentioned, we want to let user generally provides input as a list instead of those individual values one at a time. So I'm going to copy this. Let's clean this up and let's actually see what happens if I just input that list as a value right here and enter. You see program doesn't recognize that as a valid number, obviously, because we have the check and causes a value error. That's why we get your input is not a number. Don't ruin my program message right here. So we want to change that and make our program actually accept that as a valid input. So how do we actually implement it? And let's go through this logic theoretically first before we start implementing it. What we need here is that we want to read this list and we want to do validation and execution for each value one at a time. So that means that the validate and execute function needs to be called for each value in that list. So basically, this function for all this logic needs to be executed for each element. Now, how do we get the individual elements of the list? So you remember the definition of a loop? Loop is generally executing the same function with the same logic multiple times, and the number of times basically depends on the condition. Here we have a condition for the while loop, and the condition for executing the same logic for each of those elements is going to be the number of elements in that list. So we want to execute the logic as many times as we have elements in the list. For that, we have another type of loop called for loop, and we want to execute, validate and execute function using a for loop. The syntax for loop is a little bit different. First of all, we have four keywords just like for while. Then we have the element is a variable, so we can call that number of days. So the variable basically represent each of those elements in the list, and then we have in, which is again a keyword of Python. So for in puts together the for loop logic in Python. So Python knows that we are trying to execute, and finally we need the list that we are executing this loop on, and our list is our user input, and that's our for loop. However, again, you remember the indentation, the logic that for loop executes needs to be indented. So it should belongs to for loop. So now we can read the for loop statement as follow. For each element which we decide to call the number of days in a list called user input. We want to execute this logic exactly what I said before. So for each element in this user input list, we want to execute, validate and execute function. We don't have a condition written here like we did in while loop or if statement. So the condition is basically implicit. The condition says, however many elements there are in this list, that many times that function or that block of code here will get executed. So if I provide 5 elements, you will be executed 5 times. If I provide 10 elements, it will be executed 10 times. And that's exactly what we want. However, there are still a couple of things we need to do for this application to work properly. First of all, the validate and execute function still uses user input right here. So instead, we want it to use the individual values of the user input, because now it's going to be a list and not a number. So this element we can actually call it number of days element. This value should be used here instead. So we are going to use that element instead of the whole user input list and paste it here. So that fixes the first problem. And the second one is, as you know, user input is always a string. So even if we provide a list of this, it is still going to be considered as a string. So we need something similar to this right here. So the list of numbers that are provided as input needs to be converted in at least in Python. And we can actually do that in a convenient way using user input dot split, and split is a function that will take user input as a parameter and will give us a list data type. So split function basically will return a list of all those input values. And again, note the syntax of executing the split function. We are not just calling a split function like this with user input as parameter. Instead, we are calling it on user input, and I'm going to explain more about this type of functions in Python later. But for now, let's actually execute this application and see what happens. So first of all, how I'm going to provide a list to this application? So that user input, Split can actually convert it into a proper list in Python. And the way I should provide the values is a list of values with spaces between them. So basically, like that. So why spaces? How come it's not a comma or something else? The reason is because the split function by default splits that provided list on spaces and then creates a list value out of them. So that's the default behavior of split. However, we can override that behavior and we can decide, you know what? We want the input to be a list of numbers that are comma separated instead of space separated. So what we can do is right here, we can do split on a comma. So that's what our split function here will do. And now if I re-execute it, it can do commas. Now 10, comma 20, comma 30, comma 40, 50. So that's going to be user input, and split with comma should convert it into a list value in Python. So let's execute it, and as you see, it worked fine. We have a calculation for each of those values. Now let's actually play around with this, and let's say we provide a list with some values, and somewhere in between we decide to add a text and then maybe a float. So let's see what happens now. And you see that for those two valid numbers, the calculation was done properly, and for the other two, basically the validation kicked in, and it says that these are invalid numbers. However, again, our application ran without any problems, and we can even provide another input. So now let's actually do 30, maybe a boolean event and a negative number. Execute, and you see that for 30, the number of hours got calculated true is obviously not a valid, and minus 200 is a negative number. So everything works perfect. Validations in place, and we can provide a list here. Now, and as a final optimization, we can actually change this message here that says, hey user, enter number of days as a comma separated list, and I will convert it to hours. So now we can provide either just one value and it works fine, or we can provide multiple values as a list, and again, if we want to see how that list actually looks and check the type, that it has in Python. Let's actually print it. So first, I'm gonna print a type of user input called split, and then I'm just gonna print that list itself. So let's execute and let's provide some values. And here you see, this is the class list. So the data type list, and that's how our list look like. So we have these square brackets here and each element inside as a string because we have the quotes here, and later our application then transforms it or tries to transform it into an integer. And you also see there are some additional spaces here because that's how we entered the values. So generally the split splits the values on comma. So this space also becomes part of that element. So to fix that leading space in each value, we can just add a space here. So it will split on comma and space, and let's test it out. And there you go. We have our values without the space before them. So you saw an example of when we actually need to use list data types. In this example, we wanted to allow users to just input multiple values at once as a list, but obviously this is just one of the use cases for a list and one of the specific examples, because throughout the application you can create list and you can use the elements of that list in another function. So you can use it for multiple use cases. And just to show you some basic syntax of how to create list within your code inside your application. So how to initiate it and then how to use that list. It will show you the examples here. So to create a list in your code, you would use that syntax that I showed you earlier with square brackets. And inside that, you would have list of elements, and this could be strings. So it could be, for example, names of months, let's say like this, and then we would have to assign it to a variable. Again, just like we did for string or integer or other data types, so we can call it my list, and this will give us a list with 3 string values inside. And once you have created a list, you can then use it to read the values from the list. So to get the individual values elements out of that list, so for example, if we wanted to print out the first element of my list, then we would access that using my list and then following syntax with again square brackets, and then the index number of the element which is starting from 0. So this is the first element with index 0. This is the element with index 1, index 2, and so on. So it could be confusing because it starts with 0, not with 1, but that's how the specific element of a list can be accessed. So if I wanted the March values here and the third element, then I would just type in index 2, and this is a syntax of getting elements from a list. If I just want specific values and not each element one by one as we had in this example. So one way to use a list is to basically loop through it and get one element at a time, and that's why we don't need to use index here because it gives us elements one after another, or maybe we don't want all the elements or to do something for each element. We just want specific values from the list for different use cases. In this case, we can access them individually like this, and in addition to accessing the values from a list or reading the values from release, we can also add values to a list, and we can do that by typing my list, and then on the my list we are going to do dot and use the append function. So append will basically take the next element or another values and add it to the list of elements already in the list. So let's say we want to add the number next month, and now if I print my list, we should actually see this here with April as a fourth element. So let's execute, and there you go. So first we have March here printed out, which is the third element. Write index 2, and then we have my list append that adds fourth month name into the list. So after append, this is how my list will look like. And now again, we can access the specific element. For example, if we wanted to access the newly added elements on index 3, so that's going to be the fourth element, and there you go. We have the new element printed out. And also an interesting note is what happens if we use an index here which is too high. So pointing to an element that doesn't. So instead of 3, let's say we have 4 here. So this will point to the fifth element, and since we only have 4 elements, let's actually see what's gonna happen. So I'm gonna execute this, and there you go. You see an error, index error, that says a list index out of range. So every time you access or you try to access an element at an index that doesn't exist, you will get this list index out of range error, and this is actually something that may happen pretty often when working with list. So if you are accessing the values like this is how you work with list, how you create them and access values in them, as well as add some values. However, note that most of the time if you are using list, you are going to be using them in a for loop, because most of the time you would want to do something specific for each element in the list. So this basically should give you an idea of syntax of list and how to use them generally, and also how to use them in combination with for loops. Now let's go back to coding. At this point here, I want to mention a pretty minor and simple detail, but something that is also very important and useful in programming, and that is comments. So, how do we write comments in Python? And why do we need, or in which cases are comments actually useful? One uses of comments is basically to give yourself some notes on your own code. So if your code gets a little bit complicated and it's not really clear what the logic or the function body is doing, it could be because of bad programming, but also because the function logic is just a little too complicated. So you want to add some textual notes to that code so that you understand what's going on there even when you look at that code days or maybe weeks after you wrote it. So for example, right here we may want to add some notes about what this part here is doing, and comments in Python are written with this character. So for example, I want to add a note here. We want to do conversion only for positive integers, and that's basically my note that summarizes all that logic right here, and it is not only useful for myself in case I forgot what this complex logic actually does, but also for your team members. So if you are working in a team and your code gets really complex and it's difficult to keep an overview of different functions and variables and what all these things do, you can basically add these comments as notes to your team members so they can also understand what you thought or what kind of logic actually you were thinking about when writing this code. So comments is a way of communicating your thoughts and your logic on your code. So that's one use case for using comments. And the second use case, if you have a piece of code that you do not want to delete because it has some logic or it has some example that you want to keep as a reference, but you don't want that code to be executed. So you can comment out code so that it still stays here but doesn't get executed. And the way to do that is just basically having this character before the line, and also note the color of the comment in the editor is gray. So it's immediately visible that these are the comments, and now these two lines will not get executed by the program. They will be ignored, but they are for your own reference in case you want to keep it there. For example, this could happen if you are unsure about the change and you want to delete that whole code from your application because you might actually need that eventually. So you're not sure about it. So temporary comments the code before you permanently delete that. So these are some of the use cases of comments. Now, if you have multiple lines of code that you want to comment out or maybe hold text that you wrote as a note, so For example, you want to comment out all these 4 lines here. Obviously, you don't want to do this in front of every line. So for multi-line comments, you can actually use the following syntax, which is 3 quotes at the beginning and at the end, and again you see highlighting is different here, which is highlighting of a string. However, it is ignored by the program and it will not be executed. As a best practice, you shouldn't have too many comments in your code because it will just add additional clutter and your code will look unclean. So you should use them only when needed in this part. So this is all about today's session, which was list and for loop. In the next session, we will work on the next coding concept. If you guys have any doubt or any question, you can ask me in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching our video.